Thank you very much, Noel. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Darug people, and their elders, both past and present. I would also like to welcome you as the co-organisation that is organising today. It's very delightful to see so many of you here. I knew we would have this number. I was away on leave while all this was organised, and I came back to this conference fully organised while in my absence. And Otto said we might have about 60, and I said no, it'll be 150. Because I knew from past experience when we run these conferences, that's the sort of numbers we get, and we did. So it's nice to welcome you all here and be part of today with you. I am going to try and take a fairly broad view and an overview. Our organisation, Noel just got one little thing mixed up. Our organisation is state-based. We are funded on the National Affordable Housing Agreement between the state and government. But we're actually state-based, but I am actually the chair of the Community Housing Federation of Australia, and the information that Noel presented was the role of the Community Housing Federation of Australia. But otherwise you were spot on, Noel. Thank you. I don't know about you, but I tend to get fascinated by... I hope my voice is going to last. Sorry. Very sorry about that. I get fascinated by newspaper headlines, and one that attracted me last week was the one that said, "Not quite Norway, but still a great place to call home." It came out about Thursday, and it was repeated, I noticed, in the weekend papers as well, where it talks about... Thank you very much. Where it talks about a survey that was done by the United Nations called the Human Development Index. And we came second to Norway. And it is done on a scale of 0 to 1, where 1 is the top score. And Australia scored 0.93, and Norway scored 0.94. So the margin that they had over us was next to invisible. But the Human Development Index is quite interesting. It's made up of 3 areas: life expectancy, years of schooling, and gross national income. Now, we're among the most satisfied citizens on earth, typically giving a figure of about 7.5 when asked our satisfaction out of 0 to 10. And we also score exceptionally well on life expectancy with 82 years. Second only to Japan, which has 83 years. Great news for most people out there, but we all know that the UN Development Index is not the full picture. What we all see and do every day, and what we know, brings into question what other surveys there might be that reflect some other aspects of the Australia you and I live in. One quick one, and a very rough one, is perhaps to go into the Global Rich List. It's a rather frightening experience the first time if you've never been there before, because when you get in, you're asked to just simply, as I said, it's a very rough index. They just simply ask you what your salary is. And so you punch your salary in, and there are 100 little people across the screen. And you start over here on the poorest size, and you watch yourself go up and up and up until you end up in the top 1% of the world. And if you put in other figures like our lowest payment that we make to anyone as a social service payment, as a Centrelink payment, we are still in the top 3%. 97% of the world is poorer than we are. Again, a fairly rough one, and perhaps not one that serves a great deal of purpose, but it did tell me I was the 34,615th and 49th richest person in the world, which I don't want to really shout from the rooftops, because that means there's about 6 million others who are below me. I want to perhaps have some time today thinking about other things. And I want to just for a moment talk about one piece of research that is perhaps was a fairly significant research for you and I. And that is the road home, the federal government's white paper that I think they finished it in 2008. I think it was launched by the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in December 2008, and then the paper officially came out in 2009. It also had an ambitious target, and the target was to halve homelessness by 2020 and offer supported accommodation to all rough sleepers who need it. And at the launch, the Prime Minister said, "A community like this should not have this problem, so large and long-standing without being addressed. It's time we had a decent solution to this problem that has been around for such a long time." And it should be. If we are one of the richest nations in the world and come out regularly in the top 3 or 4, then perhaps we should do better. We should do better. Last week I went to the New South Wales Federation of Housing Associations AGM. It's that season of the year where people like myself, and I guess a fair number of you, spend a lot of our time at AGMs. And Gary Moore is now the Executive Officer of Homelessness New South Wales. But he moved out of the sector, so to speak, about 7 years ago. And he was their guest speaker. And he was asked to list the changes that he had noticed in coming back into the sector. And I was thinking much the same about things that have happened over the last 10 years in the whole area of homelessness. So the first 6 are ones that he had thought about and thought were significant, and I agree with them, and then I've added a few of my own. He said, first of all, the most significant one he thought was the Productivity Commission report. And it was the impact of the not-for-profit sector, of which homelessness is a key player. And he seemed to think that that was very significant. And that tied in with some thinking I was going to present to you today, and I'll raise it a little bit later. He talked about the pace of change in the sector, again, I guess, triggered by 2008 and Kevin Rudd's announcement in the white paper. And he talked about the growth, particularly partnerships, structural change that was having to happen across the sector. And he talked about also a very interesting one that I think is sort of reflected here today, but not as strongly as I've seen it elsewhere, and that is the ageing of the homelessness workforce. The wider community sector workforce, of course. There's going to be a lot of us who leave in the next 5 years, if you haven't noticed. Maybe because I'm in that group, I've noticed. He talked about corporate involvement at board level, in particular, where there's now a much stronger corporate involvement. He also talked about finance and development, how that has become a significant part of our sector. And he talked about how financiers are now employed in our sector, whereas once we might have had a treasurer on our management committee. He also talked about collaboration versus competition and how we can work better together, support each other, and yet compete. And he talked about the strong collaborative impact on the sector, and he felt that was a very positive thing. And he talked about the sector drivers, he thought, that are going with us now and into the future. And that is government outsourcing, better results with linked services, partnerships, particularly with community housing. And he talked about the reform agendas that were taking place and the entrance of the private sector into what has traditionally been a not-for-profit sector exclusive domain. And these are the changes that are going on that Gary had identified. I added 2 to it, and Noel has made reference to one of them, or Otto, I'm not too sure, made reference to one of them just a little bit earlier, that we now have a new class of homeless poor. those on middle incomes. And it was actually on the ABC yesterday morning on their 8 o'clock program. We also have another change that has been happening elsewhere, but has not up until recently affected us. And that's the FIFO, the Fly In, Fly Out Brigade. Largely in Western Australia, it has been where they would fly in and work for several weeks and then fly out. It's now happening in New South Wales, and it's happening very strongly in Bathurst, Orange and Dubbo, where new mines have been developed and old mines are being extended. And Orange now actually has accommodation that is rented out by the room. There are landlords who have realised they can charge individual room rates and provide a room for people. And that is a massive change, and that is the change that is one of the changes that's having an impact on the middle class, the bottom end of our middle class that simply cannot afford the rents that are being charged. And we've now got phenomenal rents in the regional centres. Okay.